It's a real pleasure to be part of this seminar. So thank you to the organizers for the invitation as well. I'm going to be giving a short talk today on the role of market-based instruments in meeting India's climate goals. And so let me start by sharing my screen, and I'll walk through a few slides as I talk about what I mean. Okay, I hope this is visible. So, let's start by recalling that India has made a number of ambitious voluntary commitments at both the Paris and at the Glasgow COP meetings. Right. So India's climate commitments are strong. They involve a net zero pledge by 2070, but they also involve more proximate targets of reducing the carbon intensity of our economy before that time, by 2035, by 2040. Now, if we think then about how are we going to achieve these targets, it's worth looking back and saying, these are environmental goals like our other environmental goals, such as cleaning up the air or cleaning up the water. What is the nature of environmental regulation in India, and is it ready to support these targets? And so if you look back in history, India has acted on multiple environmental goals. So we hear a lot about air pollution. This conference has had a number of conversations about that. We've also had aggressive efforts to reduce water pollution, the Clean Ganga National Mission, for example. And then we've had this conversation around CO2, mostly in the international regime, but you also see through our renewable energy pledges, for instance, strong domestic action to try and achieve this. Now, but if you look across these methods, you see a common thread running through regulation in India, which is that the main approach, sort of dating back to the 70s and 80s, is what we might call a command and control approach. And in a command and control approach, you essentially have a set of mandates that might apply to polluting sources. For example, it might apply to industries. A set of mandates are a set of orders that the polluting source must meet. So industry must install a certain type of equipment, or industry must take particular actions. And if they do not take those actions, or they do not install the equipment, or they do not meet a fixed standard, then they're at risk of closures and shutdowns. Right now, this is also how we've in large part approached dealing with water pollution in India, based again on command, an order, and then control through fixed standards, and then the punishment for that is potentially industry closures and shutdowns. Now, has this worked? It's questionable whether it's worked very well, because if you look at our local environment, you see that we have all sorts of environmental challenges. We have widespread non-compliance with our rules on paper. So even though this looks very strong on paper, it doesn't seem to be that easy to implement in practice. And the main problem with command and control is that it's not a very flexible mode of regulation. And because it's not a very flexible mode of regulation, it's fairly high cost. And it demands a lot from the regulator in terms of being able to enforce the many orders that they are putting down on the table. Now, that's kind of where market-based regulations come in. The main sort of argument for using emissions markets is that they provide a more flexible and lower cost way of meeting ultimate environmental outcomes, right? And so that's the reason to try them out. They may not always be the best solution, but it's not a solution that India has tried too much. So how do markets work? Well, let me give the example of an air pollutant, for example, or a pollutant from industry, right? So that might be particulate matter, which pollutes our air and which has been the focus of a lot of conversation. It might also be CO2, which is a global pollutant. So in a market-based regime, a cap and trade program, for instance, which is one of the instruments and the one I'll be focusing on, the regulator begins by setting a total cap. A total cap is a limit on the total amount of pollution that all of the regulated entities can emit. And the idea behind setting a total cap is I don't actually care if there are 5 industries in a city, whether you have more pollution or I have more pollution, from a health point of view, what I care is about what is the total amount thrown into the atmosphere. Likewise for CO2, what I care about is what is the sum of all the carbon dioxide that countries across the planet are pumping into the atmosphere. That's what determines how effectively we are dealing with the climate change problem. So in a cap and trade market, the regulator, which is say the Pollution Control Board or the government, begins by setting a cap. And then the regulator assigns industries permits, and a permit is an allowance to emit a certain amount of pollution, such that the total number of permits is equal to the cap. So thus far, it's looking pretty similar to the command and control. People are given permits. The permits only allow them to emit a certain amount, and the total amount is set equal to a cap. What's different about a market-based regime is that then industries are now able to buy and sell these permits with each other. So in other words, rather than having a single fixed standard, industries can say, okay, the number of permits are fixed, it's equal to the cap, but I would like to emit more. It's cheap for you to emit less, maybe because you have better technology, you have access to a cleaner fuel, whatever it may be. So I'm going to buy some of your permits. That means I get a looser standard and you get a stricter standard. In other words, the key element of flexibility that a market brings in is the ability for regulated entities to trade amongst each other so that they can set internal targets that are such that it reduces the costs for industry to a minimum. And this is very important in a country that's trying to balance environmental goals and economic goals and faster growth, right? And so for this reason, CO2 regulation is a new cost. So countries all over the world have in fact turned to markets as one way of meeting their climate commitments, right? China is the latest example. This was restricted most famously to the EU ETS initially, and then states like California in the United States. But China last year announced a huge carbon market, which will exceed the size of the EU ETS, I believe. And, very recently, the state of Gujarat, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit, also announced a carbon market as that they are hoping to put in place. So countries and states across the world are turning to this regime. And actually, it's interesting when I say Gujarat and I talked about California, it's interesting that because CO2 is a global pollutant, individual states don't necessarily have to wait for the whole country to play their part in the battle against climate change. Now, this is a comparison. I won't spend too much time on this. It's on certain technical parameters of carbon markets across the world. The main point I want to make is that if you think about India, there's a very small, relatively small number of very large industries and power plants that together create a carbon market that's roughly the size of the entire European Union ETS. And so that's this 1385 million tons of CO2 equivalent. The bottom row for India, 1355 is for the EU ETS. And so, we'll talk a little bit about what those might be, but there's also some reason to be confident about our ability to use this regulation. Thus far, there'd always been this concern about, okay, markets might work in theory, but a carbon market isn't feasible for India because India has no examples of market-based mechanisms in environmental regulation. That changed in the last 2 years. It changed because the state of Gujarat, took the lead in introducing India's first pilot emissions trading scheme, not to tackle carbon, but to tackle local air pollution, that's fine particulates. And they did this in Surat. That's a market that's now being scaled up across Gujarat. It's run successfully for 2 years. It's projected to reduce emissions from industry in Surat. So this figure is not the total air quality of Surat, but it's the projected change in emissions from industry. And we see this in the real data. So this is not just theory. This is a graph that compares industries in Surat that were included in phase 1 of the market and industries in Surat that were left out of phase 1 of the market. And this market was actually rolled out as a experiment with a treatment group and a control group so that we could compare both of those groups and see what actually happened. And what you can see is that initially both of these lines are right on top of each other. These two groups look exactly the same. That's by construction. But once the market initiates, which is after this first vertical line, you see a gap opening up between people who are regulated using the cap and trade and people who are regulated using command and control. So there's some evidence that this actually works. Now, I won't go into how these numbers that you see on your screen are calculated, but the bottom line message that I wanted to communicate is that there are about 670 odd sources in India, which are very large energy users that are already classified as large energy users. That means they burn a lot of coal or other fossil fuels or natural gas. And these large energy users together, which is about 204 thermal power plants and 400 odd large manufacturing units, together make a market that's the size, roughly speaking, of the EU ETS. And so you could imagine India now to put that in perspective, the Gujarat market alone in Surat will eventually cover about 350 plants. So you've got one state in one city working with small industries, running a market that is fully 50% already of the size of what you'd need to set up something the scale of the EU ETS in India. So there's a feasible pathway for India to set up a carbon market. And this map on the right is just the locations of these different sources. They are all across India, and a national carbon market requires a national program, but there's not a lot of them. And they're very large plants, which means they have a lot of capacity, they have good data. You're not worried about costs on very small units with limited manpower and capital. These are very large energy users. So I think that's the main message. Now, one last thing I want to close with is that we often think of a carbon market. A question that often comes up is sort of why should India initiate a cap and trade market? We're a developing country. We're not the historic reason for climate change. And all of that is true. But a carbon market is not by itself a statement about whether you're taking very strong climate action or weak climate action or intermediate climate action. Because all a carbon market does is it puts in place a set of rules that allow you to reach the target that you have decided year by year in a predictable way. And it's a predictable way because you can set a cap year by year, and the cap may grow over time if your economy is growing, or it may shrink over time in the case of a richer country like the United States or the EU, where they need to cut emissions rather than India, which needs to grow emissions. But we still have our targets. We've still said that we will not emit an unlimited amount of carbon, that we will reach a particular intensity target by 2040. And so the way we should think about markets in India is that it's a mechanism to put in place rules that ensure that we actually achieve this target that we've stated. And one way to do that is every year you look at how much electricity generation there is, how much manufacturing output there is from these 600 odd units, for example, and then you take your intensity target. You know what it needs to be in 2040. You know what it is today. You can draw a line between those two. You can draw any pathway that goes from where we are today to where we want to be in 2040, and you use that intensity target to determine what the cap should be. And the key advantage of that is that we will then know that we will meet the commitments that we have made. We will be able to demonstrate to the rest of the world that our commitments will be met because we've put in place a set of rules that will guide us on that path. So this will not depend on idiosyncratic actions by forward-looking politicians or by chief ministers or by one program that worked well or anything else. It's going to work because the private sector is also given a signal through this cap to invest in cleaner technologies. And that's the great power of a market. And what China has done, for example, is that they have made the case that once they set up a market in China, well, there's no reason why you can't link that market, for example, with, say, the European Union's ETS. And, there's there's been this long-standing, question of whether carbon finance can move from richer countries to poorer countries. There was a clean development mechanism that's taken a lot of heat for being an inaccurate measure of whether people are actually making reductions or not. One way to solve that problem is to say, well, let's all put in place a market which is denominated in the same currency, which is CO2. So when a firm in the European Union says, I would like to buy one permit from a market that will allow me to emit one unit more, well, you could imagine Europe tomorrow saying that if India and China have exactly the same sort of rules, then a permit there is just as valuable to us as a permit within Europe, because both mean the same thing. So that's sort of the long-term vision that you could imagine having. And that's basically the message I want to give through this presentation. And I think it's time that India thought very seriously about piloting these instruments. I think it's a very good idea that a state like Gujarat is trying to demonstrate how we might do that. But there's a lot of value more broadly as well. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you for listening.